Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep IAS. Before we start with our today's analysis, we have a quick gentle reminder. Byju's Exam Prep IAS is now on Telegram. If you have not yet joined the channel, please do join so that you get all the current affairs related updates. Let's get started and look into the first article. The first article is speaking about COP15 summit. Let us try and understand what are the key takeaways from the COP15 summit. What is the context? We have the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, which is referred to as COP15 Summit, which concluded in Montreal in Canada, and this happened between December 7th to December 19th. Governments from across the length and breadth of the world all came up together and they wanted to set goals to basically prevent biodiversity loss. You might ask me a question. The question is, we recently also had COP27 as well. This was also concluded in Egypt as well. What is the difference between COP27 and COP15? So COP27 is something to do with UNFCCC, which basically means that all the countries came together. They wanted to cut down on the greenhouse gas emissions. They met up and discussed about how to adopt the changes when it comes to reducing the impact of the greenhouse emissions. So COP27 was dealing with UNFCCC, which is about reducing the impact of the greenhouse gases. What does COP stands for? It stands for the Conference of Parties. What is the COP15? COP15 is basically dealing with Convention on the Biological Diversity. So one was about greenhouse gases, the other is basically dealing with biodiversity. So the primary difference is one was dealing with the greenhouse gases, the other is dealing with biodiversity. So COP27 was held in Egypt and this COP15 was held in Canada. Now, the first important question is, what is this biodiversity convention? So, the Convention on Biological Diversity happens to be a treaty. It is a treaty for the conservation and sustainable use of the biological diversity. So, what are the major goals of the CBD? When we speak about CBD, there are about 196 countries which are party to the CBD. India is also a party to the convention and India ratified it in the year 1994. So, when we speak about the goals of the convention, what are the goals of CBD? One is about the conservation. Conservation of what? Conservation of the biological species. So we have different kinds of plants, different kinds of animals, we have different kinds of species. It can be microorganisms as well. How are we going to conserve them? So how are we going to make use of sustainable use of all these products? So on one side, what we have is conservation. On the other side, how are we effectively making use of the sustainable use? So the first point is conservation, second is about sustainable use, and third is about fair and equitable use, and also at the same time sharing of benefits arising from the genetic resources. So what do we understand by fair use? Let's say, for example, there is a plant species. This plant species is discovered by the indigenous community or the local community in one of the forest areas. They know for the fact that if there is a snake which bites a person, this indigenous plant which is present in that particular area can be used so that this particular person can be saved. So this is a plant species. So what we have to do? We have to conserve this particular plant species. We also have to make use of the sustainable use as well. And at the same time, who knew about this particular plant? It is the indigenous community. So they have shared this information to the outside world as well. So as much as we are generating the profits from this particular plant species, we also have to give a share of it to the indigenous community as well. So when we speak about CBD, first is conservation, second is sustainable use, so that the future generation is also able to reap the benefits of it, and third is to use with fair use. So if there are people who are giving this knowledge, transferring the knowledge, let's give a share of the profits to these people are the basic goals of the CBD. In order to execute this convention on the biological diversity, India has created Biological Diversity Act of 2000, which was enacted for giving effect to the provisions of the convention. To implement the provisions of the act, the government established National Biodiversity Authority in 2003. The NBA happens to be a statutory body. The convention is legally binding on its signatories. The conference of parties is the governing body of the convention. It consists of the governments that have ratified the treaty. Its secretariat is in Montreal, Canada. Only two member states of United Nations are not parties to the CBD, namely the United States of America as well as the Vatican. Now, when you consider the COP15, ideally where it should have been held, it should have been held in China. Why? Because China happens to be the president of COP15. So ideally, since China is the president for COP15, this particular session should have been held in China. But this is not happening in China, but instead it is happening in Montreal, Canada. Why? That is because one, there were large scale COVID instances that were reporting in China, and China also has restrictions, COVID-19 restrictions right now in China as well. As a result, this session, which was supposed to have been taking place in Kunming in China, instead of Kunming in China, it has taken place in Montreal in Canada. So the first meeting, that is COP1 with respect to the CBD, happened in Bahamas back in the year 1994. This can also be important from the preliminary examination point of view. So COP15, the first COP15 with respect to CBD happened in 1994 in Bahamas, and COP15 is the latest. Now let's look into the data. Why is this COP15 very important? We have some key takeaways that we will be discussing, but what we have to understand is the importance of the COP15. When you look into the data, based on the current trends, the UN reckons an estimated 34,000 plant and 5,200 animal species, including 1 in 8 of the world's bird species, face extinction. About 30% of the breeds of main farm animal species are currently at high risk of extinction. Forests are home to much of the known terrestrial biodiversity, but about 45% of the Earth's original forests are gone, cleared mostly during the past century. At COP10 in Nagoya, Japan in 2010, government set out to meet 20 Aichi biodiversity targets by 2020, including that natural habitat loss would be halved and plans for sustainable consumption and production would be implemented as well. Despite taking these achievements seriously and had to be implemented by 2020, what we see is that these Aichi biodiversity targets by 2020 are yet not met as well. In fact, when you look at all the issues that have been existing, what you see is biodiversity loss, plant species are being taken away, animals are being killed as well, number of species are extinct as well. As a result, in order to keep a check on the biodiversity loss, COP15 was very important. So what we witness currently is that our planet blue, our earth where we are all living, large number of species are declining, and this is setting a dangerous precedent for the future generation as well. When we speak about the biodiversity, biodiversity play a significant role in our environment. Let's say for example, for us to have the clean air, food, habitable climate, what we require is all these biodiversity, that is the plant species and animal species play a significant role in the environment in order to meet the sustainable developmental goals. Let's say for example health, let's say for example hunger and food, all we require is the plant species as well as the animal species. So remember, this COP15 is very important because we were not able to meet the Aichi biodiversity targets by the year 2020. So basically, as much as the Paris Climate Agreement is important for the UNFCCC, this COP15 is very important for controlling the biodiversity loss. So what were the key issues that were to be taken up as part of the COP15? There were about 20 targets and proposals that were being discussed as part of it. Some of it included reduction of the pesticide use, addressing the invasive species, those species which are not endemic to that particular region but brought from somewhere else, and this changes the whole complexity of that particular environment, reforming or eliminating the subsidies that are harmful for the environment, and basically they also wanted to increase the financing from public as well as the private sector so that biodiversity losses can be controlled. So now what we have is negotiators who did discuss about all these issues, and ultimately what they have reached is a historical Paris style deal, and this deal is what is called as the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. So this Kunming-Montreal Agreement is the agreement or the outcome of the COP15. We did discuss ideally this particular session should have happened in China in Kunming, but because there are COVID restrictions, it happened in Canada, and since it happened in Canada, this agreement is called as the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. So what are the key takeaways from this particular conference? This is based on 6 issues. One is to do with conservation, protection and restoration. Delegates committed to protecting about 30% of land, 30% of coastal and marine areas by 2030, fulfilling the deal's highest profile goal known as 30 by 30. So they might ask you a question in prelim as well. What do you understand by 30 by 30? Which is about protection of 30% of the land, 30% of coastal and marine areas by 2030, and if you look at the current numbers, it is about 17% of the terrestrial or the land protection and 10% of the marine areas. So what they are planning to increase is to 30 and 30. Earlier it was 17 and 10% added to it. The indigenous community and the traditional territories will also count toward this goal, as many countries are campaigners pushed for during the talks. The deal also inspires to restore about 30% of the degraded lands and waters throughout the decade, up from an earlier aim of 20%. And the world will also strive to prevent destroying intact landscapes, areas with lot of species, bringing those losses close to zero by the year 2030. The second is to do with finances or the money for the nature. Signatories aim to ensure 200 billion per year is channeled to conservation initiatives from public and private sources. Wealthier countries should contribute at least $20 billion of this every year by 2025 and at least 30 billion a year by the year 2030. So these are the finances that have to be contributed by the country in order to prevent the biodiversity losses. Big companies report impacts on biodiversity. Companies should analyze and report how their operations affect and are affected by the biodiversity issues. The parties agreed to large companies and financial institutions being subject to requirement to make disclosures regarding their operations, supply chain and portfolio. Let's say there is one of the company or an industry, an organization working. If this particular company's operations could harm the biodiversity, it can threaten the species, this report has to be given as well. So it is mandatory for these organizations to earlier make an assessment, analysis of the impact and ultimately give it to the people. Harmful subsidies. Countries committed to identifying subsidies that deplete biodiversity by 2025 and they'll eliminate, phase out or reform them. They agreed to slash those incentives by at least 500 billion a year by 2030 and increase incentives that are positive for the conservation. There are multiple chemicals that are being used as part of the fertilizers. So these fertilizers are important, but these pesticides that are being used are also harmful to the environment as well. Let's say for example, there are multiple species which also feed on the plant, but there are pesticides that are infused on these plants. So ultimately, when these species take food from these plants, they are also harmed. So basically, if there are subsidies that are given to such fertilizers or the pesticides, they have to be reformed, they have to be eliminated, and suitable replacement will have to be brought into picture. One of the ideal, more controversial targets sought to reduce the use of pesticides by about two-thirds, but the final language to emerge focuses on the risk associated with the pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals instead, pledging to reduce those threats by at least half and instead focusing on other forms of pest management. Finally, all the agreed aims will be supported by process to monitor progress in the nature in a bid to prevent this agreement meeting the same fate as similar targets that were agreed in Aichi, Japan in 2010. This basically means that when it comes to the Aichi targets, we were not able to monitor it, but now that is not going to be the scenario. After every few months, what we will constantly do is monitor whether we were able to accomplish these goals or not. So this article primarily goes on to say that national action plans will also have to be set. These national action plans will have to be in concurrence with the international norms. They have to be reviewed and monitored, and this can also be implemented over a period of time, taking input from other countries as well. So what is the conclusion we can draw? That this Kunming-Montreal Agreement is aimed at saving the lands, oceans and species from pollution, degradation and climate change, and it is now being compared to the landmark Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is for the reduction of the greenhouse gases, and Kunming-Montreal Agreement is for protection of the biodiversity. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says criminalizing consensual relationship. The article here is speaking about statutory rape. It is speaking about adolescents who engage in sexual intimate relationship between the age group of 16 to 18. Let us try and understand in a larger picture what is this criminalizing consensual relationship all about. Let's look into the data. According to an analysis by Enfold Proactive Health Trust, romantic cases where the relationship was consensual, according to the girls, their family members or the court, constituted 24.3% of the total cases registered and disposed under the Protection of the Children from Sexual Offences Act between 2016 and 20 by special courts in Assam, Maharashtra and West Bengal. According to Crime in India 2021, 92.6% of the cases under the POCSO Act were pending disposal. Consensual cases among these are overburdening the criminal justice system. The futility of using the criminal law to regulate adolescent sexuality is also evinced by the abnormally high acquittal rate, which is 93.8%, and the fact that the girl did not say anything incriminating against the accused is 81.5%. Further, in 46.5% of the cases, the victims were married to the accused. The acquittal rate in these cases was 98.1%, as many courts did not wish to disturb the marital life of the couple. What do we understand by this? Let's say, for example, what is a statutory rape? A statutory rape is a situation where any person who is less than 18 years of age, even if the consent is given by the girl, they engage in an intimate relationship that is assumed to be a rape. So what happens in rape? A man forces himself on a girl. Consent is not given by a girl. But what happens in statutory rape? In statutory rape, consent is given by a girl. They engage in a romantic relationship, but then what happens? Because the law says that anyone who is less than 18 is not supposed to engage in any sexual activity. This is assumed as rape. Generally, when you speak about rape, consent is not given by the girl, but in statutory rape, a consent is given by the girl. But since the law says that anyone who is less than 18 years of age is not supposed to have any sexual intercourse, that is assumed as rape. We have one of the laws called as the POCSO. According to POCSO, any person, if he is less than 18 years of age, if he engages in sexual activity, that will be called as rape or the statutory rape. So this article currently goes on to say that there are large number of section of people who are between 16 to 18, where the girl would have given the consent, they would have engaged in a physical intimate relationship, but this is declared as rape. And unfortunately, when this is declared as rape, it is the girl and the boy who become the major sufferers, and this also penalizes the boy as well. What exactly happens? Whenever a POCSO case is imposed on a person, he has to go through the criminal prosecution, and ultimately that person's liberty is snatched away or taken away. He'll be thrown behind bars, or he'll be put in the protection home. He'll not be able to live a normal life, and during this particular period he goes through the lot of trauma and he ends up with the criminal prosecution. The law is also being used by parents of the adolescent girls to curtail sexual expression and safeguard family honor, And once this happens, what you have is the criminal investigation. The police employ their man force to investigate what this case is all about. As and when this investigation starts off, this will have an adverse impact on the adolescent development. Why? Let's say there is a boy who is engaged in a physical relationship with a girl. Consent has been given by this particular girl, but when there is investigation, what exactly happens? It harms his education. If he is working, it harms his employment. It also harms the reputation of this particular person, and at the same time it also harms the reputation of the family as well. So the criminal investigation further puts a black mark on this person's character in the society. For all the adolescent boys, the long-term consequences will also be incarceration and inclusion in the sex offenders registry. So once this person is also put behind bars, and if it is accepted by the court of law that this person has committed statutory rape, since there is a lot of discretion that is given to the court of law, this person may also be jailed as well. This also prevents the girls from taking the medical services and inadvertently pushes them towards unsafe abortions, and this also diverts the time and resources from the investigation and trial of the actual cases of sexual offences and exploitation. So when such cases go up to the court of law, there is criminal investigation that has to be conducted by default. But what exactly happens? The criminal investigation will require a lot of human resource. It will also consume a lot of time as well. These are the cases which have happened on consent. So even if it has happened on consent, the police officers will have to invest their time. There can be some of the scenarios where there is a heinous crime that has been committed, where they would not be able to employ their manpower for such heinous cases as well. Why? Because the manpower is also employed for such cases where consent have been given. When you look at the time period for lodging of the FIR and the disposal of romantic cases, it is about 1.4 years in Assam, 2.3 years in Maharashtra and West Bengal. This means that there is a lot of manpower that is also involved. So this article currently goes on to say that we have number of high courts as well, which have also acquitted those people who have engaged in the romantic relationship between the age group of 16 to 18. So this article currently goes on to say that if you look at the International Convention, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, in general comment number 20 on the implementation of the rights of the child during adolescence, urge states to balance protection of children from the sexual exploitation and abuse with respect for their evolving autonomy, and recommended that states should avoid criminalizing adolescents of similar ages for factually consensual and non-exploitative sexual activity. In 2019, it urged states to remove status offences which criminalize adolescents who engage in consensual sexual acts with one another. That if it is possible, the legislature will have to rethink about it, and this statutory rape provision between 16 to 18 years of age will have to be rethought of. In fact, the Chief Justice of India Chandrachud recently also spoke about the same as well. So an amendment needs to be made with respect to the POCSO Act and the Indian Penal Code. So if it is a consensual relationship between the age group of 16 to 18, they should be allowed an exemption, but if it is not consensual, they should be given the same treatment as it is now under the POCSO provision. So what we have to come up with is an amendment, says this article, and at the same time we have to give sexuality education, enable adolescents to make informed decisions, we have to provide them the knowledge, and we have to change the attitude of the vulnerable sections of the society. Until and unless these amendments are introduced, we need to have the law enforcement agencies, child welfare committees, juvenile justice board who have to use their discretion and reduce the harm to the children or the adolescents, is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the next article. This article says the cost to the country just for savings in CTC. The article here is speaking about contractual employees. The article goes on to say that there is an exponential rise of the contractual workers. The contractual workers, if they are employed by the companies, it is good for the company, but on a whole it can be harmful for the country, is what is this article all about. Let's look into the data. According to the Periodic Labour Force Survey 2021, India has about 100 million casual workers and 50 million salaried workers with no written job contract. This gives us an estimate of 150 million contract workers, or about 30% of the total labor force in the country. In the annual survey of industries, the share of contract employment in total industrial employment increased from 24% in 2004 to 38% in 2017. These non-payroll contract workers are ubiquitously cited as technicians, drivers, housekeeping, in offices, commercial complexes, or just unskilled labor in factories. After 2001, the public sector also started outsourcing many vacancies, citing them as non-core activities. Let me give you an example as what is core activity and the non-core activity. Let's say, for example, we have the BEML, or let's say, for example, we have Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. What is the core functionality of the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited? It is about building of helicopters. These are the core activities. But what is the non-core activities? Let's say, for example, for Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, the security guards who are present outside, this happens to be a non-core activity. Or let's say, for example, you have the drivers who are working for the employees of the company. So these drivers are the non-core activities. So for that particular company which is focusing on its own product, that product and its employees are the core activities. Everything else become the non-core activity, like drivers, watchmen, security, so on and so forth. In the public enterprises survey of 2021, the share of casual or the contract workers in public sector units was 17.1% in 2011 and 12, which increased to 19% in 2015 and 16 and 37.2% in 2020 and 21. There were about 4,81,395 contractual workers in central public sector enterprises in 2021. This figure was 2,68,850 in 2011, indicating the conversion of many permanent jobs into the contractual ones. Now the question is, why is it considered beneficial for the companies? When you look at the companies usually prefer the contractual employees. Why do they prefer the contractual employees over the permanent employees? That is because they would be able to generate a lot of profit. If contractual employees are recruited, these companies need not have to pay a lot of money, and they have to pay less expenses as well. So company would be able to generate a lot of profit, and at the same time they would also be able to make in for the foreign investments as well. Since they are able to show the profit, there'll be a lot of investments, and foreign companies would also likely invest in such companies. So the first reason as to why they prefer the contractual employees is because of profit. The second is with respect to the hiring cost. Whenever a particular company has to hire, what it will have is the process. So this process is the human resource process. So there is an HR team, there is also a management team as well, and there are also people who are recruited as well. There has to be this advertising that has to be given. They have to arrange for a particular place. Large number of people will also have to be interviewed. So if this process continues for a longer period of time, the hiring cost for the company increases. But if it is the contractual workers, some other company or an agency would have already hired few people. All that this particular company has to do is make a requirement, and they will be supplied with the human resource. So the hiring cost will also be reduced. Third, let's say, for example, we have a public sector unit. Let's say we have the railways, or let's say, for example, we have the UPSC itself. When it comes to UPSC or the railways or any other SSC, so on and so forth, what it has to conduct is the examinations. For example, let's say in a particular year there are about 1,000 seats for the UPSC. What is the public sector units will have to do to eliminate the rest of the people who do apply for this particular position? What they have to do is conduct the examination. Conducting examination is itself a tedious process. First, they have to ensure that applications are released. Once the applications are released, they also will have to put in human resource as well. They have to conduct the examination as well. They have to allocate which colleges and the placement cells that have to be present, and at the same time, after all this entire process is done, it would have consumed a lot of time as well as the human strength as well. So this conducting examination is a laborious process which also engages a lot of cost. The fourth is to do with generous paid leaves. If they are permanent employees, they have to be provided paid leaves. But if it is the contractual workers, they need not be provided. Then there is no commitment to promotion when it comes to the contractual workers, but promotion periodically will have to be provided to the permanent employees, and it is easy to fire the contractual employees than the permanent employees, which is the primary reason companies usually prefer the contractual workers. But this article currently goes on to say that this is not going to be good for the country. Why? That is because, let's say for example, we have more contractual workers. The contractual workers will also be paid very less as well. In comparison to the permanent workers, these contractual workers will be paid very less. And as a result, what exactly happens? These people do not have enough money. When they do not have enough money, they won't be able to buy many stuffs, and as a result, the economy will go slow. So consumption and saving for these contractual workers will be comparatively less. So it is not just them who's going to suffer, but because they are not actively participating in the economy suffers, says the author. The second is with respect to the deterioration in the service quality. If they are permanent employees, they are periodically given skill training. They are also asked to upgrade their skill set as well. They are asked to perform much better. But when it comes to the contractual workers, they do not have the skill set that is required, the morale that is required, so that they can actually learn and relearn, and ultimately it is the service that is going to be harmed over a longer run, is the second major issue. Third, they cannot afford adequate healthcare. They do not have money. They have very less salaries as well. Because they have very less salaries, they are not given the insurance by the companies. They and their family will have to bear the consequences of health related issues. So if they are not able to afford the health related issues, what could happen? The human resource that ultimately has to cater to all these products and the services, they will not be able to give their best when it comes to the services. Nobody invests in the upskilling of the contractual workers, and as a result, the skill set is not provided. The ultimate product will not be having the quality as well, and the quality of the product overall suffers, and this ultimately is going to harm the reputation of the country, as we would not be able to withstand the exports from another country. So this article currently goes on to say that there are advantages for the companies for preferring the contractual workers, but if we prefer more contractual workers, the country and the contractual workers will suffer. So basically, we have to reinvent this entire process. The public sector should reform its appraisal mechanism, award the efficiency of the permanent workers, and at the same time, the private sector should also realize that outsourcing costs the country as well, and this will harm the country in the longer run. It is this that we have to understand with respect to this article. Now let's look into the next article. This article says Bihar's prohibition policy is not working. This article here is speaking about the prohibition of alcohol in the state of Bihar. Bihar has a law called as Bihar Prohibition and Excise Act of 2016. This act basically enforces complete prohibition of liquor and intoxicants in Bihar. Under the act, manufacturing, bottling, distribution, transportation, collection, storage, possession, purchase, sale or consumption of any intoxicant or liquor is prohibited, and if someone goes about violating, they can be imprisoned. They can also be put with fines for serious offences, and their property can also be confiscated. Why did the Bihar government come up with this particular legislation? That is because we have one of the articles in the directive principles of the state policy which asks the state to prohibit the consumption of intoxicating drinks as well as drugs. Which is this article? Please put it on the comment section. Added to it, the government also realized that if the men are allowed to booze, they are allowed to drink, they are about to consume a lot of drinks. In that particular case, it is the women and their family who is going to suffer. So on one side, we have a directive principle of the state policy which asks the state to prohibit the consumption of the intoxicating drinks, which is why the government came up with this law. And at the same time, the government also felt that women and children had to be taken care of. If most of the men engage in drinking activities, excessive drinking, they would not take care of their families, which is why they introduced this particular legislation. However, this legislation is not helping primarily because of the illicit liquor that is being served in the state. So this article goes on to say that there have been large number of cases, more than 200 men have been killed because of this illicit liquor that has been given in the state of Bihar. So many political leaders have now asked the government to reconsider its decision about the prohibition policy, and at the same time the government is nowhere ready to reconsider this prohibition policy. So what are the concerns that are associated with this particular issue? One, liquor is still easily available in the state and can even be delivered at home at a premium cost as well, but it is the poor who are not able to get the liquor, and when they are not able to get the liquor, they go for the cheaper variety, they go for the illicit liquor, they go for the unlicensed liquor, and when this liquor is not maintaining the parameters that are supposed to be set, these people consume it and ultimately they are killed. Since the enforcement of the liquor law is not proper, more than 200 people have passed away, have died in several incidents. In the last 6 years, about 4 lakh cases in violation of the prohibition policy have been lodged by the state police and excise department, and 4.5 lakh people have been arrested. In fact, we also have number of neighboring states as well. These neighboring states do not have any such prohibition, so the alcohol is also brought in through the neighboring states and they are not able to prevent it. We also have the deadly nexus of the liquor mafia. They have also entered into a closer nexus with the police officers and the local couriers, and as a result, what you have is liquor which is easily available in the state. The former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice N.V. Ramana, also expressed concern that the law was enforced without the lack of foresight. What did he say? Because of the lack of foresight of the government, there are large number of cases which are piled up, and this is clogging the judiciary, said former Chief Justice of Supreme Court N.V. Ramana. He said that at least 14 to 15 judges of the Patna High Court were always kept busy each day with bail hearings in the liquor cases. In fact, another bench of the Supreme Court where Justice Sanjay and M.M. Sundaresh were hearing the bail in liquor cases, they also went on to slam the Bihar government for enforcing the prohibition law without upgrading the judicial infrastructure. So without giving more judges, special courts for this particular entity, if you go about coming up with a prohibition law, there will be lot of cases that will be filed in the judiciary, and this is wastage of the judicial time, said the Supreme Court of India. And at the same time, if there are people who are caught while drinking, they would be thrown behind bars as well, but there are large number of people who are already in jails. So what we see is excessive number of people in Bihar jails. And finally, there is new drug culture in the state, says the Patna High Court. So the Patna High Court also went on to say, since they do not have the liquor, they have an alternative option in the form of drug culture, and this is ultimately harming more youth as well as the older generation, says the author. Added to it, because there is prohibition, everything happens underground, everything happens in the black market, so the revenue that government could have generated is also missed because everything is happening underground. So basically, the government will have to revisit its policy, is what is this article all about. Now let's look into the mains practice question. Explain how the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Agreement provides a good foundation for global action on biodiversity, complementing the Paris Agreement for climate. Next question. The blanket criminalization of consensual sexual acts among or with adolescents is in gross oversight of their sexual development and bodily integrity and autonomy. Do you agree? Substantiate. Please write all your answers on the comment section, and if you wish to upload an image, you can visit the Byjus free IAS prep website as well. So this is it for today. Thank you for watching. All the best.